In that case, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this webinar event, Elections Matter, the 101 for how to get involved and make an impact. This webinar was organized by the 500 Women Scientists DC Pod. My name is Julia Bradley Cook. I am an ecologist and one of the DC Pod coordinators. Tonight, we are lucky to have a panel of 4 women who will talk about their experience in getting involved in elections. The DC Pod has developed this webinar to draw on some of our local expertise and to help motivate the national network of pods to get involved in the upcoming midterm elections. I encourage you to learn more about our organization by visiting our website, www.500womenscientists.org, and selecting the Join Us tab to get involved. Now we'll hear from Jewel Lips, an ecologist from the DC Pod and one of the leaders of the 500 Women Scientists Votes initiative. Jewel Lips will speak to us about elections. Over to you, Jewel.
Hi, thanks, Julia. Hi, everyone. This is Jewel. So now we'll cover some U.S. Elections 101. So first, why do elections matter? Why are we spending time talking about this? Well, elected officials are making decisions that have consequences in our scientific community. It might mean federal funding, research, and education, or consequences in our local communities, which might mean economic or environmental policies, or consequences for marginalized communities. It could be immigration or law enforcement policies, climate change, environmental justice, federal grants, policies for higher education, all of the above. Elections are also shaping future elections and influence who has the decision-making power for generations to come. We're seeing this right now with the Supreme Court nomination in the news. State and local elections matter too. Decisions about healthcare, education, energy, and more are made at state and local levels. During an election cycle, candidates are recruited and trained by party officials and groups like Emily's List, which gets women run. Primaries happen in the first half of the year, and the general election is in November. Lots of activity happens around elections, like fundraising, advertising, polling, endorsements. But I can't stress enough that you can't have an election without voters and what's happening with voters in an election cycle. Well, voter turnout in the US was at a 70-year low in 2014 midterms, as reported by PBS NewsHour. Only 36.4% eligible voters turned out. And notably, in our scientific communities, undergraduate voter turnout rates are like under 50%, with STEM majors turning out at lower rates. And low turnout for the midterms indicates that we can really make an impact by educating voters and working to get out the vote. And over the past 18 months, there has been an increase in public engagement and advocacy, which gives us all hopes that we can transform this energy into increased civic engagement for this election. So what can we do? As a group, we can lead voter registration drives and get out the vote. We can host or attend candidate forums. We can ask candidates to fill out questionnaires. We can create voter guides to educate voters about candidates and issues on our ballots. A simple rule for a 501c3 group like 500 Women Scientists is that we tell people to go vote. We educate voters. We just don't tell them how to vote, like not tell them who to cast their vote for. And include candidates from every party in any initiative that you organize. To get involved as an individual, you can volunteer with another local group, or you can volunteer for a candidate's campaign. This includes canvassing, going door to door, phone or text banking voters, joining the campaign team, donating, or fundraising. You can do election work as an individual, and there are no restrictions on what you can do. If it's something you do through an institution, just know that your institutional hat's seen. So 501c3s, like 500 Women Scientists, can't tell people who to vote for. And those who work at universities, generally you can encourage people to vote, register, and mobilize them, including students. And federal employees can get involved on their own time, however they like. So now as we move to our panel and Q&A, here's Emily, a social scientist from the 500 Women Scientists DC pod.
Hi, thanks, Jewel. Thanks for the overview, and we'll have questions, if any. I'm sure there's lots of questions that folks have about getting involved in the ways that Jewel talked about. So we'll have a Q&A period and a do-and-a period, so we'll talk about what we're actually going to do before the elections after we hear from our panelists. So it's my pleasure to welcome our panelists, but let's get started with our first panelist. So we are lucky to have Hala Ayala, who's a Virginia State delegate in her first year of office. And when she ran for the first time in 2017, myself, Anjali, and a couple other people volunteered for her campaign as individuals, of course, to go door knocking on weekends leading up to the election. And she was elected, and because of her support and the other newly elected delegates, Virginia finally passed Medicaid reform this year. And so, you know, for me, at least, it felt like the work that I did and that time that I put in really paid off in a concrete way. And that's why I'm excited about getting involved again this year. So Hala's going to tell us a bit about why she ran, what impact the new delegates have had in the legislature. And I should say, again, you know, we're not endorsing a particular party here, but and the role that volunteers and partners played in helping her get elected. So Hala, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate all of you for bringing me on to celebrate such a historic win in Virginia. We really had so many hopes, but didn't realize that the hopes were going to turn into 15 newly elected delegates here in Virginia. We had such a wonderful time canvassing and running for office here. It was very much a scary time and a time of uncertainty. I worked for the Department of Homeland Security for over 20 years. I am a cybersecurity specialist, one of very few women that helps stand up the largest component of Homeland Security, which is the U.S. Coast Guard Cyber Department. So one of probably very few women in STEM at that time. I didn't realize that's what was happening, but I ended up learning about network security and how to secure our nation's infrastructure, and use that to launch my career and stay with the Coast Guard for 20 years. When I talk about the Coast Guard, it's like talking about family because I was with them for so long. My career, I grew and fostered and matured in my career in cybersecurity and national security, and leaving that behind meant leaving behind securities like, you know, my economics. I'm a single parent with 2 kids, and leaving behind healthcare and leaving behind my securities. So I pulled the plug and ran for office. And it was in the wake of the 2016 elections that really kind of pushed me into that realm of running for office. I worked on campaigns and volunteered, like many of you probably have, for many campaigns, whether it's state, local, or for the president, you know, whoever's running for the president of the United States, or making phone calls, whatever activity you did for a candidate, you know, that is helpful in preparing you to run for office. And so I'd done that for 10 years. So I had an ideal of what to expect as I'm taking my journey. But I think the most scariest thing is when a woman of diverse background is running for office for the very first time, even though I have ties to my community, you just don't know how your neighbors, your friends, your people that you've done civic engagement with are going to respond. Thankfully, I was elected in 2017 to the House, and as Emily shared, we've passed some historic legislation here. The first part of that was the 400,000 individuals in Virginia will now receive Medicaid, have access to health care under the Medicaid expansion bill. We passed transformational transportation bill. that will help engage and fix and maintenance and do all the wonderful things for our transportation infrastructures. And it gave teachers pay raises, which education is a very passionate part of my campaign. Equal pay for equal work, passing the Equal Rights Amendment for women because of that pay inequity that we do face in the workforce. So it meant everything to me, even working for children with disabilities or neurodiversity. My son is on the spectrum, and I wanted to fight for his rights. There's challenges when children graduate from high school and they're transitioning into college. It just seems to have a drop off. So there's so many things that I was passionate about. So I grabbed my clipboard, grabbed my sneakers, and pulled the plug on everything I knew and felt secure about in my lifetime, and just ran for office. Volunteers like Emily and so many others made such a difference. That door-to-door contact, if you're running for office, is so important. You engage your community members, you learn so much about them, you get to know the issues. Even volunteering on other campaigns before maybe you decide to run for office is even more in preparation for what you'll be facing when you start your own campaign. Volunteers that come out for you, it was very heartwarming for me, because you, as a candidate, especially for yourself, you're like, who's going to come out for me? Who's going to knock a door for me? Who's going to care about what I care about? Actually, a nation cared about what I cared about. So many of us were helped from people all over the country that paid on their own dime to come to little old Prince William County, Virginia, to help us knock over 300,000 doors across the state. It was a full picture of what democracy looks like, of how it works when everyone puts their hands in this and fosters change. And so what I would say is that being elected was humbling to me. I don't, coming from a place where I was on welfare, not just once but twice in my life, once as a little girl because my father was killed, and then once as a parent looking for health care to help support me and my son, when the job that I had was a retail job. I'm very blessed, again, to have a seat at the table and be able to push that green button for 400,000 Virginians that may either look like me, sound like me, or have my life story. So to talk with you guys about who I am as a whole, and hopefully I put that into context, but how humbling it is to be a part of a place where they did not see women of color having a seat at the table. They didn't see women in general being a part of this, and they didn't see the diverse individuals that were going to come into these seats and make legislation that's going to impact families for years to come. And so we got to continue to work and continue to fight, because it's not just my seat, it's congressional seats, Senate seats, and then the presidential seat.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Hala, for sharing your story and your experiences and what it's been like for you and the impact that you all have had already.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we're going to have next Jess Phoenix, who's a geologist from California, a volcanologist, maybe something else that people tend to run from, volcanoes. But she also ran for the first time this year, 2018, in the primaries against an incumbent in Congress. And she's also the founder of a nonprofit organization, Blueprint Earth, which brings minority college students to the Mojave Desert to study desert ecosystems. And so Jess is going to talk to us about what it was like for her to run, about scientists stepping up, and what's next for keeping scientists involved. So Jess, are you ready?
All right. So, hey, everyone. I am pretty tired because it's 12:20 in the morning here in Iceland, and the sun is at the moment. So it's a bit of a weird situation. I slept, I woke up, so I'm a little right now. So apologies in advance. But yes, I ran for U.S. Congress in California 25th District for over a year, 415 days, but who's counting? And I will tell you that run as somebody who is totally not a politician, someone who is a scientist and, who's had experience in a variety of fields and industries in the private and public sector and in academia. Politics is, particularly at the federal level, dominated by money. And I know that sounds obvious to a lot of us, but I will tell you that that is the single biggest thing that I took away from my run for Congress. And it's really disheartening in some ways, but in other ways, it really brings the scientist in me a bit of joy, because now I understand what I'm up against. And I'm sure you all can relate to when you start to know what the field is that you're playing on, it's a little bit easier to understand what results are then possible. So I will say that, having founded and run Blueprint Earth, which actually it's an interdisciplinary organization. We're not just in the desert. We just happen to be in the desert right now. And we work with all students. And, that was good because I got a sense of federal bureaucracy. And a lot of things with starting a 501c3 are actually kind of similar to how you have to campaign, in that you kind of need to be able to stay within the guidelines that the federal government gives you. But the issue too, just like starting a nonprofit, when you start a campaign, you're taking advice from other people who presumably have insider knowledge of a sort. You can download things on the internet, you can Google, but I guarantee you, whatever approach you take is 99 times out of 100 going to be the traditional way that things are done. So when I entered the campaign, I was told by people that the only way to run for Congress is to sit in a room with no windows for 10 to 12 hours a day and dial rich people who are traditional political donors for money. Cold call them. And because my friends and family network, like I imagine a lot of your networks are, tons of people who are millionaires and billionaires on it. So I know scientists, and I don't know about you all, but I have never made that money doing science, and to the point where I can just give whoever calls me $2,700, which is the federal maximum this cycle for individual contributions per election. So you can get a total of $5,400 from an individual for the primary and the general, or you could have, if there's a runoff, you could also have another chunk in there. It's really difficult to get that, like even $2,700, if say most of your people you associate with are college students who are working with you because of your nonprofit, or fellow scientists who are early to mid-career, like a lot of my network is. So I have that going against me, but I also have background in marketing. And I would highly advise that anyone who is interested in running, there's a couple things you should do. You should check out your network, get a feel for what it could do with money, because as much as I would love to tell you it's not about money, it is. As a matter of fact, that actually, the organizations that exist often to encourage different folks to run, a lot of them will make decisions based solely, and I mean solely, on how much fundraising you've done. So you may end up behind the 8 ball a little bit if you are a scientist and you have other candidates in your field and they're plugged into the big money networks and you're not. So you have to then think about your messaging that's going to set you apart from everyone else. Obviously, I was running in a race where I could really differentiate myself by virtue of being a scientist. I could say, look, I am a scientist running against a climate science denier who sits on the House Science Committee. So that was a really strong piece of messaging that I could draw on from the start of the campaign all the way through till the very end. And it also allowed me to present myself as a unique choice for the seat. I'm not just a professional fundraiser. I'm not running for the seat because this is a good career move. A lot of people who go into politics do because they believe it will get them out of a boring career. We see that actually with a lot of lawyers. Sorry, any lawyers who are listening. It just something I've heard from lawyers and who were running is that they hate most of their job and they're tired of it. Clearly, that's not the case. I love volcanoes, so definitely not tired of that. But when you do that, when you say, I'm not running because I hate what I do. I'm running because I love my country and because I love the people in it. I know that we can do better for each other. That really connects with a lot of people. Additionally, if you not just talk the talk, but if you walk the walk in terms of what you say you're going to do with your campaign, that will actually help you regardless of whether or not you make it through. If you have a primary, if you make it through to the general, if you don't end up being elected, you will also be able to say you're proud of what you did. So in my case, that was fundraising. I realized that I wasn't going to play the big money game, and it was kind of creepy to think that a relatively small number of individuals could have so much weight in our political decision-making process. So until we managed to overturn Citizens United and the financial free-for-all it's kind of invoked for our political system, we need to focus on promoting and supporting grassroots candidates. So that goes for STEM candidates, but it also applies to any candidate who is running and saying, look, I'm not taking corporate money. I'm not using dark money. I'm swearing off all of that. And I'm going to basically go for smaller individual owners. And just to illustrate, because I know we're all numbers geeks in some fashion here, we love data. I had over 70% of my donations came from individuals giving less than $200, whereas the incumbent in my district had less than 1%. I think maybe it was 1.2%, excuse me. 1.2% of his donations came from individuals giving less than $200. So those are the sort of things that, it's harder. I obviously didn't raise a ton, but I raised $500,000. And if we have a system where raising $500,000 is seen as not raising that much money, that's a sign that clearly we have an issue with money. Until we solve that, it will be very difficult for STEM candidates who aren't independently. A lot of the engineers who've patented something, they'll have a little bit more money on their side than folks who are coming from, say, like ecology. Or fields like that. So make sure that you know your network. Make sure that you get out and you talk to people. People have a really outdated view of who a scientist is. They still think, and apologies to any older white gentlemen who are listening, but they think a scientist is an older white man. And they often believe that we are stuck in labs all day. And I know that labs are true and they're the home of a lot of scientists, but it's not the case for all of us. I mean, like I said, right now I'm in Iceland, I'm circumnavigating it on a boat. So that's my work and this is my office, weirdly enough. So it's just, you have to get out there and explain why you think different to the table. And what I found to be very effective, and I hope that anyone who's considering running or anyone who is advocating on behalf of STEM candidates themselves, but other folks, or STEM-friendly policy, just say evidence-based policymaking. That line there gets people from, I don't care what your political affiliation is, if you say that, heads start nodding, because it sounds good and at its core, it's something tangible that you can't get from the talking heads that we see so often. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that's helpful. And, I have no idea what else I was supposed to answer, and I'm sorry. But if you know something, just ask me. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Next up, we're going to have Melissa Varga, who's with the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. So they've been around for several decades now, in case you're not familiar with them, but they have a lot of expertise in helping scientists get involved in issues they care about. UCS is a great friend of 500 Women Scientists, and so we're happy to have Melissa talk to us about what they do in policy and elections and why, some of the successes they've had and opportunities they see, and a new voting rights project that they're also working on. So Melissa, are you ready?
I'm ready. Can you guys hear me?
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, well, that's a lot to cover in about 5 minutes, so hopefully I can touch on all of those. As Emily mentioned, my name is Melissa. I work at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and as Emily mentioned, UCS has been around for 50 years. We put science to work to build a healthier planet and a safer world. We believe in this crazy idea that science should guide government policies, an idea that shouldn't be quite so radical, but is increasingly at odds with how we're seeing decisions being made and policies being passed. And historically, our main focus has been on creating change through the policymaking process, mainly at the federal and state levels. And we also get involved in some pretty wonky work to make sure that the decision-making processes in government are science-based. I'll touch on that a little bit more later. But despite mainly focusing on policy, given the increasing number of attacks on science that we're seeing, especially in the past year and a half, we're really focusing a lot more this year on turning people out to engage in the midterm elections and helping them to think through what it means to stand up for science in the midterm elections. And UCS's goals are very similar to the goals that Jewel laid out at the beginning of the call. We're trying to equip both scientists and science supporters with the resources and skills that are needed to talk to candidates about issues that affect our health and safety and the environment. And so I'm going to quickly run through a few types of activities that UCS is providing some training and resources for, or resources on for our supporters in order to engage them. And first up, next week we're holding a webinar on how to engage with candidates in different ways. And I know that Sheril is going to speak more to that later, so I won't dive in too much, but this will be a great follow-up from today's webinar, and will also tie into some of the resources that I know the DC 500 Women Scientists Pod is coming out with later this summer. So I'll share the link for that in the chat box in a bit, and also share it on the hashtag 500WS votes if you're following on Twitter. One of the big initiatives that UCS is partnering with and working on this year is called Science Rising. We're working with over 20 organizations, including 500 women scientists, on this nationwide mobilization that's taking place throughout 2018 in the lead up to the midterms. It's a series of local activities, events, and actions with the shared goal of bringing science front and center into the decision-making processes that affect all of us. So if you check out the website, sciencerising.org, you can find events, activities, resources, stories devoted to taking action around the midterms. Some of my favorite events that have been featured so far are a Black Panther themed event called Wakanda STEM Equity Outreach in Oakland. There was a public comment writing workshop training scientists to submit public comments to the Federal Register, which there are so many critical public comment periods that are open this summer. So a really important workshop. And there's a launch of a new Puerto Rico Science Policy Action Network, which is coming up in September. So a lot of great events to check out there. And a few examples of types of events that you could organize on your own. Events with candidates from both sides of the aisle if you're trying to stay 501c3 compliant, such as town halls and candidate forums, are really good for both visibility and engagement. Adrienne Keller, who's a PhD candidate at Indiana University, helped to organize a local candidate forum right on her campus, actually, and talked about it on a recent webinar that we hosted. That's available to check out on sciencerising.org. She walks through the steps of how they got the candidates there, how they developed the questions about science. Super great resource. Another thing you could do is to work with a local community group who's tackling some science-related issues. For example, UCS has worked with scientists who've supported community-led events around groups that are concerned about lead in water. These events are opportunities to make sure that people are registered to vote. They're thinking about the connection between science and the issues that they're seeing in their community, and to talk with them about the importance of science-based decision-making in government and connect all of those issues up. Another important thing scientists can do is to lend their voice to existing events. There's another People's Climate Movement series of events coming up in September. There's no need to reinvent the wheel if there's an awesome event happening in your area. So make sure you do your research first. And finally, I wanted to make a pitch for all of you to think more broadly about what we consider to be quote unquote science issues, and to think about how they intersect with other issues that impact our lives and the issues that people base their votes on. We should be doing a better job, I think all of us should, connecting the dots between science and all of the issues people care about, and helping to build the narrative about the intersection of these issues so we can build more power as a movement. And to give a really specific example, I'm thinking about voting rights. My colleague Mike Latner, who's a scholar on gerrymandering and voting rights, who we brought on recently at UCS, wrote, "When voting rights are compromised, it is typically because policymakers are attempting to insulate themselves from electoral pressure on critical policy issues. As we've seen in areas as diverse as climate policy, transportation, food systems, and even global security, when policymakers are shielded from electoral accountability, they are more susceptible to the influence of powerful, narrow interests." So you can say attacks on voting rights have indirect but potentially very damaging impacts on science issues. And I think we need to think critically about science's role in a functioning democracy and be better allies with other groups and individuals who are speaking out against these attacks on our electoral system. And I would be happy to chat more about that during the Q&A or offline at any time. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Melissa. That's a message that definitely resonates with 500 women scientists too. All right, and so finally we'll have Sheril Kirshenbaum, who's the Executive Director of Science Debate, which works to raise the profile of science policy issues in elections through candidate surveys, among other things. And Sheril is going to talk to us about the impact of their work and the ways that they're bringing science into public debate this year. So Sheril, are you ready?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me tonight.
Thank you.
I guess I'll just give you a real brief history of science debate and tell you a little bit about what we're doing in the midterms and toward 2020 and how we'd love to have more of you all involved. I started in science. I was getting my PhD in marine biology. And I know you're thinking whales and dolphins, but for me it was all about sea cucumbers. So I totally understand what Jess was saying, that we get to do cool stuff because nothing is cooler than sea cucumbers. But I had one of those opportunities to be a science fellow on the Hill. So I started working for Bill Nelson. He's a conservative Democrat still in office. He's in Florida. That was 2006. And I also had a master's in policy, thought I understood how this whole policy making thing worked. I had watched Schoolhouse Rock, so I knew about the Bill on the Hill. And it didn't work like that. I mean, it took me months just to understand what all the acronyms were. The first day, everyone was talking about R&D, and I was thinking, like, this is awesome. They all care about research and development. And no, it was Republicans and Democrats. Like, I was so far out of my comfort zone. But I learned a lot from the experience, and most of what I took away, I think the most important piece was that, for the most part, and again, this was years ago. This was before there was even a Tea Party, so I'm dating myself here. But I could have these amazing scientists come through my office who didn't know how to have a clear message or didn't really know what the take home should be for staffers. And I was working with some of the smartest people that I've ever had the pleasure of working with. And I'd have a lot of pseudoscience groups pushing a special agenda coming through our office as well, had PhDs, sounded really smart, told a lot of jokes, gave us food and all sorts of other gifts that are probably a little more strict about keeping those out of those meetings. But needless to say, at the end of the day, for someone who doesn't have the expertise in science, which is most staffers working on Capitol Hill, they might be great at a whole bunch of other fields. They don't have the expertise to know who to trust. And at the end of the day, it wasn't the scientists that were making the strongest case for evidence-based policymaking. So it seemed like there was a really important niche to fill. I got more into writing about science and science policy, but around 2007, my co-author of my first book, Chris Mooney, and I were talking a lot about science and the policymaking process, and got into a conversation with Matthew Chapman, who's one of our co-founders, about why we weren't hearing about significant science issues leading up to the 2008 election. We weren't hearing about climate change. We weren't hearing about oceans. We weren't hearing much about health outside of a few talking points. And at the same time, we were hearing about all these other issues that were clearly related to science, but not in that context. So we co-founded this organization with a handful of other people, a ragtag team, me in science and a few other science people, but screenwriters, journalists, philosophers, like a really interdisciplinary group with a very simple ask saying that, we as citizens want to hear about science. We are a C3, so we don't advocate for any position. We just think democracy works best when people are informed. And we think that we should all be informed on policy positions related to science leading up to elections. Prior to this, we've only worked with presidential candidates. So we've worked with President Obama twice, Governor Romney, Senator McCain. And then in the last election, we worked with Hillary Clinton's campaign, the two third-party candidates, Gary Johnson and Jill Stein. And somehow even Donald Trump spoke to us about what his policy would look like related to science. We gave them 20 questions that we curated from a list with the help of leadership at the National Academies, at AAAS, and a whole bunch of our partner organizations, of which UCS is one of them. And we got them on record. There's a lot of research to support that if candidates publicly state what their policy positions will look like before taking office, they're far more likely to follow through on them. That's been true during the Obama years. I can't say that Donald Trump has stuck to everything that he said, but we do have a record of what he said he would do when it comes to science. So we do Q&As. My guess is that most of you hadn't heard of us much before 2018, and that was okay because we primarily worked at the national level directly with campaigns. The thing is, we've been expanding, we've gotten funding, we've been up to now always an all-volunteer organization. We just hired on our first employee, so we're growing. And for the 2018 midterms, we have a 10-question Q&A for all congressional and gubernatorial candidates. So as much as we can make a lot of noise at the national level, it's really on the people who will be candidates' constituents to ask them these questions. And then we have an interactive map on our website where you can click on a state, find your candidate, and see if they've answered these questions. They're on a whole variety of topics. I completely agree with what Melissa was saying a moment ago about finding other ways to engage and talk about these issues. So like we're really interested in mental health and the opioid crisis and post-traumatic stress disorder, and a lot of things that are in the news, but maybe people aren't immediately associating with science. Science is inherently related to every challenge we face in the 21st century, so I feel like it's really easy to make those connections, and we're working now to partner with groups both in and out of science. We have a lot of science partners. We want to work with more veterans groups, more groups thinking about solving opioids, a lot of kind of issues that are part of the conversation, but not necessarily always framed this way. So in short, success to me would no longer be needing to exist, right? Where science is the expectation that we'll hear about it leading up to elections rather than the exception, excuse me. While a Q&A and a survey is great and gets people on record, ultimately we would love to have live events, so live science forums. We're hoping to get more people like you guys showing up at town halls and forums, bird dogging candidates, which means asking them questions from the survey or just asking, have you answered science debates questions? And we are not publicly announced yet, but we are working toward a primary presidential forum next year, 2019, New Hampshire. So watch for that. We'd love to have as many people involved in organizing as possible, because as I said, we are a small team, mostly all volunteer. So there's a lot more I can say. We're really excited moving into the midterms. We've gotten some candidates to fill out our survey. A lot of candidates, as I'm sure Jess can tell you, are told by their advisors not to participate in surveys or Q&As unless they see a real advantage. But I think more and more groups across the country are making that case. One other thing to mention, we have mini grants available to groups that are working in conjunction with things that support answering Q&As and getting science forums together. And we're really excited, and we need you. We feel like this is a real movement, so we need more people involved. And finally, we have these handy dandy I Vote for Science bumper stickers. If anyone's interested, we're going to be giving them away with donations, but if anyone here wants to just send me an email or a tweet, I'd be happy to pop one in the mail. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Sheril. We are going to have actually a follow-up webinar in a couple of weeks, I think, where we'll drill into some more details on actions such as the candidate surveys and such. But let's go to questions and see if anyone on the line wants to ask any of our panelists a question or talk about, an idea that you all have or how you might like to be getting involved this year with the elections. So
I saw a good question for Sheril and Jess I'd love to share from Emily. It might have been another Emily. I don't know. But it's okay, good. But I love this question, and I'd love to hear Sheril answer it and Jess answer it. What is the best way to get a questionnaire to a candidate? Like you mentioned bird dogging. So maybe you can break that down a little bit. Maybe Jess, you can talk about it from the candidate's perspective.
Sure. I mean, I guess I can start and then Jess can jump in. And Jess, I was watching your campaign with great interest. So wonderfully done. And I hope you do it again. So bird dogging is just showing up, right? Like a lot of us are interested, and especially lately, we feel like there's so little that we can do. We feel powerless. Well, bird dogging and asking candidates these questions is like a really good way to get them engaged. So bird dogging just means showing up at town halls, forums, asking your questions. And they don't know whether or not this has been organized, but if they keep hearing the same questions over and over, or even they keep hearing, have you answered a survey, they start to feel like, hey, my voters are paying attention to this. Maybe that's something I should look to. But honestly, having worked in an office during a campaign, my boss was up for election that year. I wasn't on his team on the campaign side, but those phone calls, those emails, all of those are documented. All of those matter. So while you might feel like you don't have as much of a voice, or you don't feel like you're being represented, a candidate's going to pay attention to the people that are actually making the effort to call them, because so many don't. So I would absolutely pick up the phone, send an email, write a letter, any way that you can engage that's comfortable for you. I feel like we all have a role to play, and we all can be part of that conversation.
And to add to that, I would actually say that we have new technologies available, use them. I know that a lot of folks probably found out about my candidacy because of Twitter or Facebook. And those are really good tools to engage with your candidates, particularly if they are grassroots candidates, because the odds are greater that they'll actually be on their own social media, at least from time to time. I will say that the most effective asks I got for filling out any sort of surveys were from, via email or via phone call. When I got letters in the mail, people saying, oh, fill this out, was only from groups that had positions that were completely opposite from mine. In particular, some real gun rights folks, real anti-choice folks, and those are things I was very outspoken about. So they sent it to me, and they what the language was if you don't respond, we will tell our members that you are hostile to our positions. So I went, okay, go ahead, and ignored them. But so I would say that if you actually have a real person making the ask, or at an event, a public event, or if you have the ability to engage via social media, a candidate more directly, do that. The other thing to be cautious about, though, is that oftentimes you will, in response to a survey, it will be filled out by a member of your staff. I let my staff fill out surveys for me because I'm kind of like, okay, I can state my positions more eloquently. Oftentimes I would let them do the basics for me from initial answers I had given, and then I would check them. Some candidates have it fully automated. So just be aware that the most genuine answer you'll get from a candidate is typically face-to-face when they're not expecting it. So yes, I'm urging you to surprise the heck out of anybody running, because they should be able to answer you with authority and conviction. And if they can't, think twice about what they're saying.
That's excellent. We had a question from Melissa about engaging students, and wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the student who organized the campus town hall, and what are your thoughts on how students, grad students in particular, could get more involved?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of resources on campuses especially that are ripe for student engagement and for students to bring candidates to campus. It's a great photo op for candidates and for elected officials generally, which I know candidates are often looking for. And there are some pretty specific event checklists and guidelines out there for how to do it well. So I would say that, student groups should definitely consider working with the, obviously the administration on campus, but other local community groups as well to bring candidates there. Yeah, I'm happy to chat more about that on or offline. And I think the event planning checklist is available on sciencerising.org to check out.
Great, thanks, Melissa. I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Sheril, did you want to address that a little bit too? I know you all also work with students.
Yeah, I just would share something has happened. I mean, we have oh, you guys hear me, right? Sorry, my computer's a little funny. We have a group of grad students that I especially just want to highlight, entirely created their own initiative without any outside leadership other than what they've asked of us. They meet every month. This is at Michigan State University. 2 women earning their PhDs have a large group of interested students and community members come together once a month. Each meeting is focused on one of our 10 questions. So they might have a whole session where it's facilitated on ocean policy or agricultural policy, which is big in Michigan. They have an expert, not necessarily from campus. We have people from the Center for American Progress come and visit. And it's a conversation about that issue that's a back and forth. There's a lot of listening. There's not a lot of talking at the group. So they do that for half the time, but then they spend the other half phone banking. Or using Twitter or whatever means that person wants to do to engage with the candidates in that district. But it's a really cool model, and I'm sure they'd be happy to share any of the details of how that works, because I just show up when I can. They've done it completely on their own.
And actually, maybe that's another question for one of the panelists would be, when should people start getting involved? You know, when should people start really looking at who's running in their area and what they can start doing?
Yeah, right now, yesterday, last week, but actually in seriousness, if people need to engage at the local level, which means going to local Democratic club events or whatever you're into. If you're a Republican, go to Republican club events. Go to groups like the Sierra Club, like the League of Conservation Voters, if they have meetings near you. Go to any citizens action groups on environmental issues, if that matters, or animal issues, or just city council meetings, because you need to meet people in your community in order to make the connections that will galvanize people to take action.
And just to piggyback off of that, yeah, don't wait till you're invited, and try to learn more. Like, so when I worked on the Hill, there were so few people with any kind of science background. So I wanted to get involved in science policy. And I think a lot of us assume that means only running for office. I think that's certainly a great way to do it, but also serving on someone's staff. Whenever I move to a new town, I'm on my 9th state now, I meet my representatives and I tell them I'd be happy to be a resource. And they don't always want me to, like in Texas, my reps weren't as keen on it all. But making yourself available and building that trust, often they will take you up on that. On top of that, there's so many groups that are now training candidates. A lot of us know about the 314s, but like I went through the Emerge program, Emerge Michigan, there's one in almost every state. And they explain how the whole building your kitchen cabinet works and, you know, the kinds of things you need to think about if you're running for office. I'm not running for office, but I'm really interested in getting to know the people who are in my area so I can be a resource for them. So there's a lot of opportunities, and they're looking for young people. They're looking for people with diverse backgrounds who don't look like that old white guy who you expect to be running.
Great. All right. Any last call for questions anyone has, or thoughts or other ideas that you would want to share about how you're going to be getting involved this fall?
There was a question for Jess for what's next for you, having run, and I've talked to and worked with a lot of scientists who've run for office and served in office, and I'm always so interested to hear about how that experience shapes their careers and their thinking about what their career is.
Yeah, so for me, obviously, what's next? Well, volcano, and then Yosemite, and then Tanzania. Where else am I going? Indonesia. That's where I'm going this year. Sorry, can't keep it straight. So those things are coming up, but that's all before the end of August. I also, I am not the sort of person who wants to do the same thing again and expect a different result. So it would be pretty monumental if I decided I was going to run again, because I said through the whole campaign, this was it, one and done. However, that's not the case for everyone. And I would actually say that you can stay involved and voice in different capacities, even if you yourself aren't a candidate for themselves and for what they want to do. And I would also, I founded a super PAC. I hate big money. However, if you to deal with the anti-parks caucus in the House and Senate, you need to have money to do that. And so I'm not going to hide it behind dark money, behind a 501c4 like we often see. But I founded a super PAC called Protect Our Parks, and or Parks PAC, and people can find we just have a basic website right now, it's parkspac.org, and I'll be running that and trying to raise awareness of the fact that the parks belong to all of us, regardless of political affiliation, and we need to highlight folks who take votes that are against our parks. So that's what I'm doing in the short term. We'll see in the long term, but you're definitely not going to see me disappear. See, I'm even accountable when I'm in Iceland.
Great, that sounds super exciting. Good luck. All right, Jewel, are you ready to wrap it up then?
Thanks everyone so much for this discussion tonight. Have this last slide to share. So yeah, thank you, Emily, Erin, Julia, and our awesome panelists, Hala, Jess, Melissa, and Sheril. So everyone tuning in, we encourage you to get involved in midterm elections. Just to recap, you can volunteer for a candidate, you can volunteer with a local organization, you could lead an initiative with your 500 Women Scientists pod. And we will have another webinar for 500 Women Scientists pods to strategize about candidate questionnaires, getting candidates on the record, especially thinking about science and science justice topics, and prepping voter guides, and the 500 Women Scientists Votes programs for a concerted voter registration and get out the vote effort. So this information and more resources are on this webpage, 500womenscientists.org/getoutthevote. We have science debate up there, and Union Concerned Scientists Science Rising. We'll put the recorded version of this webinar up on this webpage. And you can also use the local pods page of 500 Women Scientists to find a pod or start a pod. So thank you all so much for joining tonight. So let's get involved and make an impact.